You should be very grateful you still have a seat here.
You should be very grateful to still have a seat here, Elena, Richard Thornton announced from the head of the conference table, and everyone erupted in laughter. The 14 executives around that mahogany table laughed so hard that coffee cups rattled against saucers. What none of them knew, as they wiped tears of amusement from their eyes, was that Elena Morrison owned 95% of the company they were sitting in. This is the story of how Elena went from being the joke of the boardroom to the woman who dismantled an empire of arrogance, piece by calculated piece. It started 6 months earlier, on a cold February morning in Manhattan. Elena walked into Thornton Industries headquarters at 7:45, like she did every morning, carrying her leather portfolio and a grande Americano from the Starbucks 2 blocks down. She was 32 years old, the youngest senior analyst the company had ever hired, and she'd spent 5 years building financial models that saved Thornton Industries millions. Richard Thornton didn't hire Elena because he believed in her talent. He hired her because his board forced him to after a discrimination lawsuit from another company made headlines. She was his diversity hire, his token, his proof that Thornton Industries was progressive. He made sure she knew it too. "Morning, Elena," Marcus Webb said as she passed his office. Marcus was Richard's right hand, a man who'd been with the company for 20 years and treated it like his personal kingdom. "Richard wants to see you. Conference room B. Now." The way he said it made Elena's stomach tighten. "Welcome, besties. Say hi in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. To my returning besties, if you stop in the middle of the story, you'll have dreams wondering how it ended. So, to avoid this curiosity, ensure you be a part of this story till the end. I promise you won't regret it. If you enjoy strong women's stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too." Elena entered conference room B to find Richard sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Marcus and 3 other senior executives she recognized: Thomas Chen, Patricia Holloway, and David Kumar. The atmosphere was thick with something she couldn't quite name yet. "Elena, sit down," Richard said, not looking up from his phone. She sat. "We've been reviewing your performance," Marcus began, sliding a folder across the table toward her, "and we have some concerns." Elena opened the folder. Inside were her performance reviews from the past 5 years. Every single one rated her as exceptional or outstanding. Her financial models had identified cost-saving opportunities worth over $12 million. She'd predicted market trends that kept Thornton Industries ahead of 3 major competitors. "I'm not sure I understand," she said carefully. "These reviews are all positive." "That's the old metric system," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We've implemented new standards, more rigorous, more objective. And under these new standards," Richard finally looked at her, "you're barely meeting expectations." The room spun slightly around Elena. New standards that were implemented when, exactly? "Last week," Thomas said, "applied retroactively to evaluate all current personnel." "Retroactively," Elena repeated the word slowly, letting it hang in the air. "So you've changed the measurement system and reapplied it to work that was already completed and approved?" "We're well within our rights as management," Marcus said sharply. "The question is whether you can meet our new expectations going forward." Elena looked at each of them in turn. Richard, with his silver hair and expensive suit, leaning back in his chair like a king on a throne. Marcus, his loyal attack dog, watching her with barely concealed contempt. Patricia, who Elena had mentored for 6 months when she first joined, now unable to meet her eyes. Thomas and David, who she'd collaborated with on dozens of projects, suddenly treating her like a stranger. "What exactly are these new expectations?" Elena asked. Richard smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "We're restructuring your role. You'll be supporting the junior analysis team instead of leading projects. Your salary will be adjusted accordingly. 30% reduction." 30%. Elena's voice came out steady, though her hands were shaking under the table. "For the same hours?" "Actually, we'll need you to increase your hours," Marcus added. "The junior team needs someone available for questions. We're thinking early mornings and late evenings. You know how it is when you're learning." They wanted her to train her own replacements while taking a massive pay cut and working longer hours. They wanted her to quit. No, they wanted her to break. I'll need to review this with my lawyer, Elena said. Richard's smile widened. Of course. You have 48 hours to accept the new terms or resign. If you resign, you'll receive 2 weeks severance. If you're terminated, well, these performance reviews will make it difficult to find similar work elsewhere. Wouldn't you agree? Elena stood up, gathered the folder, and walked out of that conference room with her head high and her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't go back to her desk. She went straight to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and let herself shake for exactly 5 minutes. Then she washed her face, reapplied her lipstick, and did something she'd been avoiding for 3 years. She called her uncle. Elena's uncle, James Morrison, was someone she rarely talked about at Thornton Industries, partly because he taught her to make it on her own merit, and partly because the connection might have complicated things. James Morrison was a private equity investor based in Toronto, Canada, and he was very, very good at what he did. Elena, his voice was warm when he answered, this is a surprise. How's New York treating you? Uncle James, I need your advice, Elena said, walking out of the building and into the February cold, and possibly your help. She told him everything over coffee at a small cafe 3 blocks from Thornton Industries. The discrimination, the impossible standards, the restructuring designed to push her out. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. How much do you know about Thornton Industries' financial structure? He asked when she finished. I know the public information. Privately held, family company Richard owns about 60%. 58%, actually, James corrected. The rest is split between various investors and executives. But here's what you don't know. Richard's been using company funds to cover personal expenses for years, millions of dollars. I've heard rumors in certain circles, but no one's been able to prove it because the company's financial records are locked down tight. Elena's mind started racing. I have access to those records. It's literally my job to analyze financial data. Had access? James reminded her gently. They're restructuring you out. Remember? I have 48 hours before I respond, she said, and I still have my credentials until then. James looked at her for a long moment. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, you need to be very careful, very thorough, and very certain. I'm certain that what they're doing is wrong, Elena said. I'm certain that if Richard is embezzling, other people should know, and I'm certain that I'm not going to let them destroy my career without a fight. Then let's talk about what a fight actually looks like, James said. They spent the next 4 hours in that cafe, James on his laptop, Elena on hers, mapping out a strategy. He explained how corporate takeovers worked, how to identify undervalued assets, how to find investors willing to buy up shares in a private company. He told her about a firm in London that specialized in exactly these situations. But Elena, he said as they packed up to leave, this isn't just about revenge. If you start this, you have to be prepared to finish it. These men will come at you with everything they have. Your reputation, your character, your personal life, everything will be fair game to them. They already came at me, Elena said quietly. They just did it with smiles and legal language. At least if I fight back, I'll do it honestly. That night, Elena went back to her apartment in Brooklyn, and she made a decision. She wasn't going to quit. She wasn't going to accept their terms. She was going to document everything, find every piece of evidence she could, and she was going to take Richard Thornton's company away from him. The next morning, Elena arrived at Thornton Industries at 6 a.m., 2 hours before anyone else. She had her laptop, 3 external hard drives, and a very specific list of files she needed to access. Her credentials still worked. Her access to the financial databases was still active. They'd been so confident she would just go away that they hadn't even bothered to restrict her permissions yet. She started with the expense reports. Richard Thornton had signed off on hundreds of transactions over the past 3 years, and Elena began downloading every single one. Company credit card statements, wire transfers, vendor payments, everything. She organized them by date, by amount, by category, and as the sun began to rise over Manhattan, a pattern started to emerge. Richard had been billing personal expenses to the company for years. A $70,000 renovation to his Southampton beach house, charged as office renovations. $200,000 in luxury car leases for his family, listed as company vehicles, private school tuition for his 3 children, coded as professional development expenses, a vacation to the Maldives, classified as a business development trip despite there being no Thornton Industries clients or prospects anywhere near the Maldives. The list went on and on. Elena's hands moved faster across the keyboard as she copied files, cross-referenced transactions, and built a timeline of fraud that stretched back nearly 5 years. By 7:30, she had downloaded over 2,000 documents, and her external hard drives were nearly full. That's when she heard voices in the hallway. "I'm telling you, she's not going to accept the terms," Marcus was saying. "She'll resign by tomorrow. I know her type." "Good," Richard replied. "The last thing we need is another harassment complaint because someone couldn't take constructive feedback. Better she leaves voluntarily." Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard, closing windows, ejecting hard drives, clearing her digital footprint. By the time Richard and Marcus walked past her cubicle, she was sitting calmly, reviewing what appeared to be a standard market analysis report. "Elena," Richard said, stopping, "you're here early." "Couldn't sleep," she said, looking up with a carefully neutral expression. "Wanted to get a head start on some projects." "About that," Marcus interjected, "until you make your decision about the restructuring, we're going to need you to focus solely on transitional documentation. You know, making sure your work can be easily handed off." Translation. They wanted her to spend her remaining time writing instruction manuals for her own replacement. "Of course," Elena said smoothly. "I'll get started on that right away." They walked away, satisfied. Elena waited until they were in Richard's office with the door closed before she slipped the external hard drives into her bag. She had everything she needed. Now she just needed to know what to do with it. Over the next 2 days, Elena barely slept. She spent every waking hour analyzing the data she'd collected, building a comprehensive case against Richard Thornton. She found shell companies he'd set up to funnel money through, fictitious consultants who were really just his friends receiving checks for work they never did, and accounting irregularities that would make any auditor's head spin. The total amount Richard had stolen from his own company over 5 years was staggering, $8.3 million. But Elena knew that exposing Richard's fraud wasn't enough. She needed leverage, she needed power, and she needed to ensure that when she acted, she did so from a position of absolute strength. That's when her uncle James called her with an idea. "I've been making some calls," he said, "reaching out to some investors I know who might be interested in Thornton Industries. There's a firm in Sydney, Australia, Marchmont Capital, that specializes in corporate turnarounds. They've been looking for opportunities in the North American market." "And?" Elena prompted. "And they're very interested in the information you've collected. But more than that, they're interested in you. They want to know if you'd be willing to front a takeover bid." Elena's heart started pounding. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," James explained, "that Marchmont provides the capital. You provide the inside knowledge and evidence of fraud. And together you approach the minority shareholders of Thornton Industries with an offer to buy them out. If we can get enough shareholders to sell, we can force Richard out of his own company." "That's possible?" Elena asked, her mind already running through the mathematics. "It's more than possible. Richard owns 58%, but that's split between him personally and a trust for his children. The trust shares are controlled by an independent trustee, Margaret Chen, who happens to be Thomas Chen's mother. If we can convince her that Richard is damaging the company's value, she might be persuaded to sell the trust 22%. That would leave Richard with only 36%. Elena calculated quickly. "Exactly. And the remaining 42% is split between 12 different investors and executives. We need to acquire at least 37% to have majority control when combined with the trust shares. That means convincing 9 of those 12 to sell to us." It was audacious. It was complicated. It was exactly what Elena needed to do. "When do we start?" she asked. "Tonight," James said. "There's a flight to Toronto at 7 p.m. Marchmont's representatives are flying in from Sydney to meet with us tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have." Elena looked around her small apartment at the life she'd built in New York over the past 5 years. She thought about walking away, about accepting the severance, and moving on. It would be easier. It would be safer. But it wouldn't be justice. She booked the flight. The meeting with Marchmont Capital took place in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Toronto's financial district. Elena sat across from three representatives. Catherine Rhodes, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who ran Marchmont's North American acquisitions, David Park, their lead financial analyst, and Jonathan Webb, their legal counsel. Elena presented everything she'd found: the expense reports, the shell companies, the fictitious consultants, the $8.3 million in stolen funds. She walked them through 5 years of Richard Thornton's fraud, backed by documents, bank statements, and email chains she'd quietly collected over the past 48 hours. When she finished, Catherine leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Miss Morrison," she said, "you've just handed us the most thoroughly documented corporate fraud case I've seen in 20 years. But I need to know something before we proceed. What do you want from this?" Elena didn't hesitate. "I want Richard Thornton to lose everything he stole. I want the company to be run by people who actually care about it. And I want to be the one who makes it happen." "Not money?" David asked, surprised. "Money's a byproduct," Elena said. "Justice is the goal." Catherine and her team exchanged glances. "We can work with that," Catherine said. "Here's what we're proposing. Marchmont Capital will fund the acquisition of shares up to $40 million. You'll be the public face of the takeover, the insider who exposes the fraud and leads the reform. In exchange, you'll receive a 15% equity stake in the restructured company and a position as chief financial officer. 15% of Thornton Industries was worth approximately $18 million. "And Richard?" Elena asked. "Richard will be forced to sell his remaining shares at market value, which, given the fraud revelations, will be significantly depressed. He'll also face civil and potentially criminal charges for embezzlement. By the time we're done, Richard Thornton won't have a company, a reputation, or possibly even his freedom." Elena felt something settle in her chest, something solid and certain and strong. "Let's do it," she said. The plan moved quickly after that. Jonathan Webb, Marchmont's legal counsel, filed a confidential complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission detailing Richard's fraud. Simultaneously, James began quietly reaching out to Thornton Industries' minority shareholders, feeling out their satisfaction with Richard's leadership and their willingness to sell. The responses were more positive than anyone had hoped. 8 of the 12 minority shareholders were frustrated with Richard's management style, his refusal to modernize the company, and his increasingly erratic decisions. They didn't know about the fraud yet, but they were already primed to want change. Elena spent 2 weeks working with Catherine and her team, preparing presentations, refining their pitch, and strategizing exactly how to approach each shareholder. She also reached out to Margaret Chen, the trustee who controlled the 22% held in trust for Richard's children. The meeting with Margaret took place at a quiet restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. Margaret was an elegant woman in her late 60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "My son speaks highly of you," Margaret said as they sat down. "He says you're one of the most talented analysts Thornton Industries has ever had." "That's kind of him," Elena said carefully. "Though I'm not sure Richard would agree." "Richard is a fool," Margaret said bluntly, and Elena nearly choked on her water. "He inherited a good company from his father and has been slowly running it into the ground through sheer arrogance. My role as trustee is to protect the financial interests of his children, not to protect Richard from his own incompetence." Elena took a breath and slid a folder across the table. "Then you need to see this." Margaret read through the evidence in silence, her expression growing darker with each page. When she finished, she looked up at Elena with something like respect in her eyes. "How much of the company are you acquiring?" she asked. "Enough to remove him," Elena said. "I have commitments from 8 minority shareholders representing 31%. With your 22%, we'll have controlling interest." "And you have the capital to buy out my shares at fair market value?" "We do." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I've known Richard since he was a boy. His father was a good man, built that company with integrity and hard work. Richard has dishonored that legacy." She looked directly at Elena. "You have my support. The trust will sell its shares to your consortium." Elena felt victory within reach for the first time. By the end of February, Elena and Marchmont Capital had secured commitments from shareholders representing 53% of Thornton Industries. They were ready to make their move. The plan was simple and devastating. On Monday, March 4th, Jonathan Webb would file the SEC complaint publicly, triggering an immediate investigation. Simultaneously, Elena would present evidence of fraud to Thornton Industries' board of directors and call for an emergency shareholder vote on Richard's removal. Because Elena and her partners now controlled the majority of shares, the vote's outcome was predetermined. Richard would be out. But Elena had one more step to complete. She needed to go back to Thornton Industries, accept their restructuring terms, and wait for exactly the right moment to strike. On March 1st, Elena walked back into Conference Room B, where Richard, Marcus, and the same group of executives waited. "Well?" Richard asked impatiently. "Have you made your decision?" "I have," Elena said, sitting down calmly. "I'll accept the restructuring terms." Relief flashed across Marcus's face. Richard actually laughed. "Smart decision, Elena. I'm glad you're choosing to be reasonable about this." "Oh, I'm being very reasonable," Elena said. "I'll need a few days to transition my projects properly. Let's say until Monday?" "Monday's fine," Richard agreed, already dismissing her in his mind. "Have everything documented by end of day Monday. You can start your new role on Tuesday." "Perfect," Elena said, and walked out. She had 72 hours until Monday, and she spent every single one preparing for Richard's destruction. While she publicly worked on transition documentation, she privately coordinated with Catherine, Jonathan, and James, ensuring every piece of their plan was perfectly synchronized. Elena also reached out to Patricia Holloway, the executive who had been part of her ambush meeting but seemed the least comfortable with it. They met for coffee on Saturday morning. "Patricia," Elena said, "I need you to answer me honestly. Did you know they were targeting me before that meeting?" Patricia looked into her coffee cup, shame written across her face. "I knew something was happening. Marcus told me they were restructuring several positions. I didn't know it was just you until I walked into that room. Why didn't you say anything? We worked together for months. I helped you when you started." "Because I was scared," Patricia admitted. Richard made it clear that anyone who didn't support his decisions would be next. "I have a mortgage, student loans, a family. I couldn't risk it." Elena understood fear. She'd felt it herself in that bathroom stall, shaking and wondering if her career was over. But understanding didn't mean accepting. "Patricia, I'm going to give you a choice," Elena said. "On Monday, something's going to happen at Thornton Industries. Something big. You can either be on the right side of it or you can go down with Richard and Marcus. But you need to decide now." "What's going to happen?" Patricia asked. Elena told her. Patricia's eyes grew wider with each detail. When Elena finished, Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you need me to do?" Monday morning arrived cold and clear. Elena dressed in her best suit, a dark navy Armani she'd been saving for special occasions. She arrived at Thornton Industries at 8 a.m., carrying her portfolio and a flash drive containing 5 years of evidence. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. At 9:45, Elena walked into the executive boardroom where Richard, Marcus, and 12 board members were gathered for what they thought was a routine quarterly review. "Elena," Richard said, surprised, "this is a board meeting. You shouldn't be here." "Actually," Elena said calmly, taking a seat at the table, "I have something the board needs to see." "This is inappropriate," Marcus snapped. "You need to leave." "Sit down, Marcus," Margaret Chin said from her position at the table. As trustee for a major shareholder, she had a permanent board seat. "Let's hear what Miss Morrison has to say." Elena plugged her flash drive into the presentation system and pulled up the first document. "For the past 5 years," she began, "Richard Thornton has been systematically defrauding this company. He's stolen $8.3 million through fake expense reports, shell companies, and fictitious consultants. I have documentation of every transaction, every transfer, and every lie." The room exploded. "This is slander," Richard shouted, standing up. "I'll have you arrested for defamation." "Sit down, Richard," Margaret said coldly. "Let her finish." Elena walked him through everything. The beach house renovation disguised as office expenses, the luxury cars, the private school tuition, the vacation to the Maldives, the shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, the payments to consultants who didn't exist. With each revelation, the board members' expressions grew more shocked, more angry, more betrayed. These are fabrications, Richard insisted, but his voice had lost its confidence. She's making this up because she's angry about her performance review. Then explain this, Elena said, pulling up bank statements. These are transfers from Thornton Industries accounts to Summit Consulting, a company that supposedly provides market analysis services. Summit Consulting's business address is a mailbox in Delaware. Its sole owner and operator is your brother-in-law, who works as a high school gym teacher in Connecticut. Are you claiming he's providing $8,000 a month in market analysis? Richard had no answer. Or this, Elena continued, pulling up another document. $70,000 paid to Westridge Property Management for office renovations in March 2023. Except Thornton Industries didn't do any office renovations in March 2023. But you did renovate your Southampton beach house that month. And the contractor who did the work? His invoice matches this amount exactly. I have his statement confirming that Thornton Industries paid him for work on your personal property. The board members were staring at Richard with expressions ranging from fury to disgust. You've been stealing from us? Margaret said quietly. From your own company? From your children's trust? I haven't stolen anything. Richard's face was red now, veins standing out on his forehead. These are legitimate business expenses that she's misinterpreting because she doesn't understand how executive compensation works. Actually, Jonathan Webb said, standing up from where he'd been sitting quietly in the back of the room, she understands perfectly. My name is Jonathan Webb. I'm legal counsel for Marchmont Capital. I'm here to inform you that the Securities and Exchange Commission received a formal complaint this morning detailing Mr. Thornton's fraud. They've frozen the company's accounts pending investigation. I'm also here to inform you that as of 9 a.m. this morning, Marchmont Capital, in partnership with Miss Morrison and several existing shareholders, now controls 53% of Thornton Industries stock. The room went silent. Richard stared at Elena, comprehension finally dawning in his eyes. You, he whispered, you did this. I documented what you did, Elena corrected. You destroyed yourself. I call for an emergency vote on Richard Thornton's removal as CEO and chairman, Margaret announced. All in favor? 8 hands went up immediately, then a 9th, then a 10th. By the time the count finished, 11 of the 12 board members had voted to remove Richard. The only one who voted against was Marcus, Richard's loyal attack dog, and even he looked shaken. The motion passes, Margaret said. Richard Thornton, you are hereby removed from all positions at Thornton Industries, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Marcus Webb, given your close association with Mr. Thornton's activities, your employment is also terminated effective immediately. 2 security guards who Elena had quietly briefed earlier that morning stepped into the room. Richard turned to Elena, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. You can't do this. This is my company. My father built this company. Your father built a company based on integrity, Elena said quietly. You turned it into your personal piggy bank, and now it's over. You'll never run this company, Richard spat as security took his arms. You're nothing. You're a diversity hire who got lucky. Everyone knows it. Actually, Catherine Rhodes said, standing up from her seat at the table, Miss Morrison is Thornton Industries' new chief financial officer, and she owns 15% of the company. I'm Catherine Rhodes, Marchmont Capital's lead representative, and I'll be serving as interim CEO during the restructuring. And Richard, you're not nothing. You're a thief who's about to face federal charges. As security escorted Richard and Marcus out of the boardroom, Elena allowed herself to feel the weight of what she'd accomplished. It wasn't celebration yet, just acknowledgement. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. The rest of the day was a whirlwind. Catherine and the board made formal announcements to staff about the leadership change. Jonathan coordinated with federal investigators who arrived to begin their examination of Richard's fraud. Patricia, who'd agreed to testify about the hostile work environment and discriminatory practices, gave her statement to Marchmont's HR team. By 6 p.m., it was all over the news. CEO of Thornton Industries removed amid fraud investigation. Whistleblower leads takeover of major finance firm. Female executive exposes years of corporate embezzlement. Elena's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News outlets wanted interviews. Former colleagues wanted to congratulate her or distance themselves from Richard. Her mother called crying, proud and terrified in equal measure. But Elena just sat in her new office, the one that used to belong to Marcus, and let herself breathe. Over the next 3 months, the full extent of Richard's fraud became public. The SEC investigation revealed that he'd actually stolen closer to $9.8 million when accounting for all the hidden transactions. His Southampton beach house was seized as proceeds of crime. His luxury cars were repossessed. His country club membership was revoked. Richard Thornton, who'd spent his entire adult life building a reputation as a successful business leader, was now infamous as a white-collar criminal. The man who'd laughed at Elena for being grateful to have a seat at his table didn't even have a table anymore. Criminal charges were filed in June. Richard's lawyers tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence was too overwhelming. He was facing up to 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement. The trial wouldn't happen for another year, but the outcome was essentially certain. Meanwhile, Elena transformed Thornton Industries. With Catherine's support and her own strategic vision, she restructured the company's operations, eliminated the toxic culture Richard had created, and implemented transparent financial practices that would prevent future fraud. She hired 3 new senior analysts, including 2 women of color and a man from the United Kingdom who brought fresh perspectives to their market analysis. She created mentorship programs, established clear promotion criteria, and instituted regular third-party audits of executive expenses. The company's value increased by 32% in the first 6 months under the new leadership. In August, Marchmont Capital announced they would be gradually selling off their Thornton Industries shares to the employees through a stock ownership program, transforming the company from a privately held family business to an employee-owned cooperative. Elena's 15% stake alone was now worth $28 million. But the real victory came in September, when Elena walked into the same conference room where Richard had tried to destroy her career 6 months earlier. The quarterly board meeting was starting, and Elena sat at the head of the table where Richard used to sit. Margaret Chen was to her right, Catherine Rhodes was to her left. Around the table sat the new leadership team Elena had built, diverse, talented, and committed to running Thornton Industries with integrity. Before we began, Patricia spoke up, and Elena noticed she looked different now, more confident, more solid. I want to say something. 6 months ago, I was part of a meeting where Richard and Marcus tried to force Elena out of this company through intimidation and discrimination. I didn't speak up. I didn't defend her. I chose my own comfort over doing what was right. She looked directly at Elena. I'm sorry for that, and I'm grateful that you gave me the chance to do better. We all get chances to do better, Elena said. The question is what we do with them. The meeting proceeded smoothly. Financial reports were strong, employee satisfaction scores were up, client retention was excellent. Everything Richard had claimed Elena would ruin was actually thriving under her leadership. As the meeting wrapped up, Margaret stayed behind. You know, she said, Richard called me last week from his lawyer's office. He wanted me to testify on his behalf. Tell the court he was a good man who made mistakes. What did you say? Elena asked. I told him that good men don't steal from their children's trust fund, and that his mistakes were actually crimes. Margaret smiled slightly. Then I told him that the best decision I ever made as trustee was selling those shares to you. His children's inheritance is worth more now than it ever was under his leadership. Elena felt something shift inside her, something like closure. Thank you, she said, for trusting me. Thank you for being worthy of trust, Margaret replied. The day of Richard's sentencing arrived in November, 11 months after Elena had first walked into that conference room to face her own ambush. The courtroom was packed with reporters, former employees, and investors who'd been affected by his fraud. Elena sat in the gallery, watching as Richard stood before the judge. He looked smaller now, diminished. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by the desperate hope of a man who knew he'd lost everything. Mr. Thornton, the judge said, You were entrusted with leadership of a company that employed over 200 people and served thousands of clients. You betrayed that trust for personal gain. You stole from your employees, your investors, your own children. The court finds no mitigating factors that would justify leniency. Your Honor, Richard's lawyer interjected, my client has expressed deep remorse for his actions. He's willing to make full restitution. With what funds? The judge interrupted. Mr. Thornton has no assets left after seizures and civil settlements. His promises of restitution are meaningless. The judge looked at Richard directly. You are sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay $9.8 million in restitution, which will be garnished from any future earnings. This court is adjourned. Richard's legs buckled as bailiffs moved to take him into custody. He looked back at the gallery, his eyes finding Elena's. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the courtroom. Then Elena stood up and walked out. She didn't need to see Richard taken away in handcuffs. She'd already seen the only ending that mattered. Justice served, truth vindicated, and a corrupt system held accountable. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded her. Miss Morrison, how does it feel to see Richard Thornton sentenced? Do you have any message for other corporate whistleblowers? Was this about revenge or principle? Elena thought about her answer carefully. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. This was never about revenge. It was about accountability. Richard Thornton believed he was above the rules, that his position entitled him to steal from the people who trusted him. Today's sentence proves that no one is above accountability, no matter how powerful they think they are. What message do you have for women facing discrimination in the workplace? Another reporter called out. Elena smiled slightly. Document everything. Build your case. Find your allies. And never, ever accept that you should be grateful for a seat at a table you helped build. Sometimes the best response to being pushed out is to take over entirely. The reporters love that. It would be the headline in a dozen publications by tomorrow. But for Elena, the real victory had already happened. It happened in that board meeting when Richard was voted out. It happened when new employees started joining Thornton Industries because they'd heard it was now a great place to work. It happened every time she walked into the office and saw a company culture built on merit and integrity instead of cronyism and theft. 6 months later, Elena stood in the same conference room once again, but this time for a very different meeting. Thornton Industries was celebrating its 75th anniversary, and Elena had invited all the employees, shareholders, and board members to mark the occasion. As she looked around the room, Elena thought about how much had changed. Patricia was now a senior vice president, leading a team of analysts with confidence and skill. The 3 new hires she'd brought in were thriving, bringing innovative approaches that had already saved the company millions. The employee stock ownership program meant that everyone in the room had a stake in the company's success. And Richard Thornton was in a federal prison in Pennsylvania, serving the first year of his 12-year sentence. Margaret Chen tapped her glass to get everyone's attention. I want to say a few words, she began. 75 years ago, Harold Thornton founded this company with a simple philosophy: do good work, treat people fairly, and build something that lasts. His son lost sight of that philosophy. But the woman standing before you today, she brought it back. The room erupted in applause. Margaret continued, Elena Morrison saved this company not just from fraud, but from a culture that valued loyalty over integrity, silence over truth, and power over principle. She did it with courage, with thorough documentation, and with an unwillingness to accept injustice. Because of her, Thornton Industries is stronger, more profitable, and more ethical than it has ever been. More applause. Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion. So, I'd like to propose something, Margaret said. The board has voted unanimously to rename this company. Effective immediately, we are no longer Thornton Industries. We are Morrison Thornton Financial, honoring both the founder's vision and the woman who saved it. Elena hadn't known this was coming. She looked at Catherine, who was grinning, then at Patricia, who was wiping away tears, then at the dozens of employees who were cheering. I don't know what to say, Elena admitted when the noise died down. Say you'll keep leading us, someone called out from the back. Say you'll teach us to be as brave as you. another voice added. Elena took a breath, centered herself, and spoke from the heart. When Richard Thornton told me I should be grateful to still have a seat at that table, he thought he was putting me in my place. What he didn't understand was that I didn't need his permission to belong there. I'd earned that seat through years of excellent work, innovative thinking, and dedication to this company's success. She paused, looking around the room at faces that were actually listening, actually valuing what she had to say. But here's what I've learned over this past year. It's not enough to earn your seat. Sometimes you have to be willing to flip the entire table. Sometimes you have to dismantle the corrupt system and build something better in its place. And sometimes the people who tell you to be grateful are the ones who should be grateful you didn't destroy them completely. The room was silent, everyone hanging on her words. Richard Thornton is in prison because he believed the rules didn't apply to him. He's there because he thought his position made him untouchable. He's there because he confused power with immunity and authority with righteousness. Elena's voice grew stronger. But most of all, he's there because he underestimated a woman who refused to be silenced. The applause was deafening. So yes, Elena said when it quieted, I'll keep leading us. I'll keep fighting for a company culture where everyone has a voice, where merit matters more than connections, where integrity is valued over profit, and where no one ever again has to choose between their principles and their paycheck. That's my promise to you. As the celebration continued, Elena found herself standing by the window, looking out over Manhattan. Her phone buzzed with a message from her Uncle James in Toronto. Proud of you, Elena. Your father would be too. Her father had died when she was 15, but she remembered his words. Do the right thing, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. This fight had cost her. It cost her sleep, security, and peace of mind. It cost her the comfortable path of accepting injustice and moving on. But it gave her something more valuable, the knowledge that she'd stood up, fought back, and won. Elena thought about Richard in his prison cell, stripped of the power and prestige he'd valued above everything else. She didn't take pleasure in his suffering, but she felt satisfaction in the balance of justice. He'd stolen from hundreds of people, destroyed careers, created a toxic culture of fear and favoritism. Now he was paying the price. And she was standing in a company that bore her name, leading a team that respected her, making decisions that would affect hundreds of lives for the better. She was proof that the system could work, that truth could triumph, that courage could be rewarded. The evening wound down around 10 p.m. As people began to leave, Elena stayed behind in the conference room, sitting in the chair at the head of the table. The same chair where Richard had sat when he'd tried to humiliate her. The same table where he'd laughed at the idea that she should be grateful. Patricia entered the room, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. She handed one to Elena and sat down beside her. Thank you, Patricia said quietly, for giving me the chance to choose the right side. You made that choice yourself, Elena replied. I just opened the door. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Patricia asked, do you ever wonder what you'd be doing if you'd just accepted Richard's restructuring terms? If you'd taken the pay cut and quit later? Elena considered the question. Sometimes, she admitted, I'd probably be working at another company, rebuilding my reputation, wondering if I'd made the right choice. But I'd always know I walked away from a fight that mattered. Instead, you won it, Patricia said, raising her glass. To women who fight back. To women who win, Elena corrected, clinking her glass against Patricia's. If you're watching this and thinking about Elena's courage, about her refusal to be silenced or intimidated, then you need to do something right now. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us what you think about women who refuse to be broken. Subscribe to Excellent Stories so you never miss another story of powerful women who win. Because if you don't, if you scroll past without engaging, it's like saying you're okay with what Richard did. It's like saying you support the Marcus Webbs of the world who help corrupt leaders silence truth tellers. Don't be that person. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Show us you stand with women like Elena. The next chapter of Elena's story unfolded over the following year. Morrison Thornton Financial grew by 45%, hired 60 new employees, and was named one of the best companies to work for in the United States by 3 major business publications. Elena was featured in Forbes, Fortune, and Bloomberg Businessweek. She spoke at conferences about corporate ethics, whistleblower protection, and building inclusive workplace cultures. But the moment that mattered most to her happened on an ordinary Tuesday in March, exactly 2 years after that devastating meeting in Conference Room B. A young woman named Jessica Chen, fresh out of business school, walked into Elena's office for her first day as a junior analyst. She was nervous, excited, and ready to prove herself. "Miss Morrison," Jessica said, "I just wanted to tell you that you're the reason I applied here. I wrote my thesis about corporate whistleblowers, and your case was my primary example. You showed that it's possible to fight back against corruption and actually win." Elena smiled, remembering how she'd felt at 24, walking into Thornton Industries for the first time, determined to make a difference through excellent work and integrity. "Jessica," she said, "the most important thing I can teach you is this. Never let anyone make you feel grateful for opportunities you've earned. Don't let them diminish your achievements or question your worth. Document everything. Build your case. And if you ever find yourself facing injustice, fight back with truth." "What if I'm scared?" Jessica asked quietly. "Be scared," Elena said. "Be terrified. But do it anyway. Because the alternative, accepting injustice and letting corrupt people win, that's so much worse than fear." Jessica nodded, absorbing the wisdom. "I won't let you down." "You won't," Elena agreed. "And if anyone ever tries to push you out, to restructure you into insignificance, to tell you that you should be grateful, come directly to me. I'll remind them what happens when powerful men underestimate brilliant women." As Jessica left to start her training, Elena returned to her work. She had a company to run, employees to support, and a legacy to build. Not a legacy of fear and fraud like Richard's, but one of integrity, opportunity, and justice. 3 years after Richard's sentencing, Elena received an unexpected letter. It was from Richard himself, written from federal prison. The letter was 12 pages long, rambling and self-pitying in places, but it contained something Elena hadn't expected, an actual apology. Richard wrote about how prison had given him time to reflect on his actions, to understand the harm he'd caused. He wrote about the arrogance that had made him believe he was entitled to steal, the fear that had driven him to lash out at anyone who threatened his position, the desperate need to maintain an image of success even as he destroyed the foundation it was built on. "I told you that you should be grateful to still have a seat," he wrote in the final paragraph. "But the truth is, I should have been grateful to have someone as talented and ethical as you at my company. Instead, I tried to destroy you because your integrity highlighted my corruption. I tried to push you out because your competence exposed my mediocrity. I tried to break you because I couldn't stand seeing someone succeed through merit when I'd only succeeded through inheritance and theft. I'm sorry, Elena. Not because I got caught, though that's part of it, but because I genuinely harmed you and so many others, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to understand how I became that person." Elena read the letter 3 times. She didn't forgive Richard, exactly. Some actions went too far for easy forgiveness. But she acknowledged his apology, filed it away, and moved on. Richard's redemption, or lack thereof, wasn't her responsibility. She'd already done what she needed to do, hold him accountable, and build something better in the ashes of his empire. 5 years after the takeover, Morrison Thornton Financial was unrecognizable from the company Richard had run. It was larger, more profitable, more innovative, and more ethical. Employee turnover was almost zero. Client satisfaction was at record highs. The company had expanded into international markets, opening offices in London and Sydney, partnering with firms that shared their commitment to transparent, ethical business practices. Elena was 39 years old now, no longer the youngest person in the room, but still one of the most respected. She'd mentored dozens of young professionals, helped launch careers, and created pathways for talented people who might otherwise have been overlooked. And on the 5-year anniversary of Richard's removal, Elena did something she'd been planning for months. She established the Morrison Foundation for Corporate Ethics, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting whistleblowers, investigating corporate fraud, and promoting ethical business practices. The foundation's first initiative was a legal defense fund for employees who expose wrongdoing in their companies. Elena knew from experience that fighting corruption required resources, support, and allies. Too many whistleblowers were destroyed financially by the legal battles that followed their decisions to speak up. The foundation would ensure they had the backing they needed. The second initiative was an annual award recognizing companies that demonstrated exceptional ethical leadership. Morrison Thornton Financial would, of course, be ineligible to win, but Elena wanted to celebrate organizations that proved profit and principle weren't mutually exclusive. At the foundation's launch event, held in the same conference room where Richard had once ruled, Elena addressed a crowd of business leaders, journalists, and ethics advocates. 5 years ago, she began, I sat in this room and listened to powerful men tell me I should be grateful. Grateful to still have a job after they'd systematically undermined my work. Grateful for a paycheck after they'd slashed my salary by 30%. Grateful for their permission to exist in a space I'd earned through talent and dedication. She paused, letting the words settle. They thought gratitude would keep me quiet. They thought fear would keep me compliant. They were wrong on both counts. Elena's voice grew stronger. Because sometimes gratitude isn't the appropriate response to injustice. Sometimes anger is. Sometimes courage is. Sometimes the willingness to burn everything down and rebuild it better is exactly what the situation requires. The room was absolutely silent. The Morrison Foundation exists because I refuse to believe I was the only person who ever needed support in fighting back. I refuse to believe that corruption wins because whistleblowers are alone. This foundation will ensure that people who choose truth over comfort, who choose integrity over security, who choose justice over silence, will have the resources to see their fight through to the end. The applause was thunderous. After the event, as Elena was gathering her things, an older woman approached her. She was probably in her 70s, elegantly dressed, with kind eyes. Miss Morrison, the woman said, my name is Helen Thornton. I'm Richard's mother. Elena froze, unsure what to say. I wanted to meet you, Helen continued, because I needed to apologize for my son. My husband built Thornton Industries on values that Richard betrayed. Watching what he did to the company, to you, to so many others, it broke my heart. Mrs. Thornton, you don't need to apologize for his actions, Elena said gently. Perhaps not, Helen agreed. But I want to thank you. Thank you for holding him accountable when no one else could. Thank you for saving a company my husband loved. And thank you for showing my grandchildren that integrity matters more than family loyalty when family is wrong. She handed Elena an envelope. This is a letter from my late husband, written years ago when he first started having concerns about Richard's character. He never sent it because he hoped Richard would change. But I think you should have it. It might help you understand that you didn't destroy Harold Thornton's legacy. You saved it. Elena opened the envelope later that evening, alone in her office. Harold Thornton's letter was dated 3 years before his death, and it outlined concerns remarkably similar to what Elena had discovered. Questionable expenses, ethical shortcuts, a willingness to prioritize image over substance. The letter ended with a paragraph that brought tears to Elena's eyes. If you're reading this, it means my fears were justified, and Richard has done something that threatens the company I built. Please know that Thornton Industries was never meant to be a monument to family ego. It was meant to be a place where good work was rewarded, where integrity was valued, where people could build careers and lives with dignity. If Richard has corrupted that mission, then I hope whoever finds this letter will have the courage to do what I couldn't. Hold him accountable and restore the values this company was founded on. That person, whoever they are, is the true heir to what I built. Not my son, the person brave enough to do what's right. Elena carefully folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. She thought about Harold Thornton, about building something with love and pride only to watch your child corrupt it. She thought about legacy and responsibility and the weight of doing the right thing even when it cost you. And she thought about that conference room 5 years ago, when Richard had laughed at her and everyone joined in, when they told her to be grateful for scraps, when they tried to break her spirit and destroy her career. They'd failed so completely that it was almost funny. Elena Morrison didn't just keep her seat at the table. She took the whole company, rebuilt it from the ground up, turned it into something better than it had ever been under Richard's leadership, and created a foundation to help others do the same thing. And Richard Thornton, he was 7 years into a 12-year prison sentence, with 5 more years of supervised release after that. His reputation was destroyed. His wealth was gone. His power was meaningless. The company that bore his family name for 70 years had been renamed to honor the woman he tried to destroy. Perfect justice didn't exist. Elena had learned that. But this was close enough. 10 years after the takeover, Elena stood in a very different conference room in the Sydney office of Morrison Thornton Financial. The company now had over 600 employees across 4 countries. The employee stock ownership program meant that hundreds of people were building wealth and security through their work. The Morrison Foundation had supported 43 whistleblowers in exposing corporate fraud, leading to 17 successful prosecutions and hundreds of millions in recovered funds. Elena was 44 now, and while she still loved the work, she'd started thinking about succession planning. Not because she was ready to retire, but because good leaders built systems that could thrive without them. She'd identified 3 potential successors, all of whom embodied the values she'd worked so hard to instill: merit over connections, transparency over secrecy, courage over comfort. 2 were women, 1 was a man who'd immigrated from India and brought innovative approaches to sustainable finance. All 3 were brilliant. Whoever took over Morrison Thornton Financial would inherit a company that proved ethical business practices and profitability weren't mutually exclusive. They'd inherit a culture where speaking up was rewarded, where diverse perspectives were valued, where no one ever had to choose between their integrity and their career. That was Elena's real legacy. Not the money, not the fame, not the revenge against Richard Thornton. Her legacy was building a system where what happened to her couldn't happen to anyone else. As the Sydney office celebrated their quarterly results, another record-breaking period of growth and success, Elena received a notification on her phone. It was from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Richard Thornton had been released on parole after serving 10 years of his 12-year sentence. Good behavior, model prisoner, all the right phrases. He was now a 68-year-old man with no wealth, no reputation, and no company. His conditions of parole included restrictions on corporate leadership positions and ongoing restitution payments that would continue for the rest of his life. Elena stared at the notification for a long moment. Then she deleted it and returned to the celebration. Richard's story was over. Hers was still being written. 2 weeks later, Elena was back in New York when she got an unexpected call from Patricia. "Turn on the news," Patricia said urgently. "Channel 7. Elena grabbed the remote and switched to the channel Patricia indicated. What she saw made her sit down slowly. Richard Thornton was giving an interview. His first public appearance since his release from prison. He looked old, worn down by a decade in federal prison. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by a simple button-down shirt and slacks. His arrogance was gone too, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. "Mr. Thornton," the interviewer was asking, "you spent 10 years in prison for defrauding the company your father built. What do you want people to know about that experience?" Richard took a breath before answering. "I want people to know that I deserved every day of that sentence. I stole from people who trusted me. I created a culture of fear and favoritism. I destroyed careers, including that of one of the most talented financial analysts I've ever worked with, because she threatened my ego." "You're talking about Elena Morrison," the interviewer said. "I am," Richard confirmed. "Elena Morrison saved the company I was destroying. She exposed fraud I was committing. She rebuilt a culture I had corrupted. And I tried to destroy her for it, because I couldn't stand that she was better at the job than I ever was." "Do you have anything you'd like to say to her?" the interviewer asked. Richard looked directly at the camera. "Elena, if you're watching this, I want you to know that you were right and I was wrong. About everything. You deserve that seat at the table more than I deserve to sit at the head of it. You earned your position through talent and integrity, while I inherited mine and destroyed it through arrogance and greed. I'm sorry for what I did to you, and I'm grateful that you didn't let me break you. The world is better because you fought back." Elena felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of it, or at least the end of anger. Her phone rang almost immediately. It was Margaret Chin. "Did you see it?" Margaret asked. "I saw it," Elena confirmed. "What do you think?" Elena considered the question carefully. "I think that sometimes people do change. I think 10 years in prison gave Richard time to understand what he'd done wrong. I think his apology is genuine." She paused. "But I also think that genuine remorse doesn't erase the harm he caused. He can spend the rest of his life being sorry, and that's good, but it doesn't change the fact that he stole millions, ruined careers, and corrupted an entire company culture." "So you won't forgive him?" Margaret asked. "I didn't say that," Elena replied. "I said his apology doesn't erase the harm, but holding on to anger doesn't serve me anymore. Richard Thornton destroyed himself. I just documented it and held him accountable. His redemption or lack thereof is between him and whatever he believes in. I've moved on." And she had. Elena Morrison had spent 10 years building something beautiful from the wreckage of Richard's corruption. She'd created opportunities, changed lives, and proved that powerful women don't just survive, they win. That was enough. The interview ended with Richard announcing that he'd written a book about corporate ethics and accountability, donating all proceeds to organizations that support whistleblowers. It was a small gesture in the face of massive harm, but it was something. Elena turned off the television and returned to work. She had a company to run, employees to support, and a legacy to continue building. Richard's story was his own now. Hers was still being written, one ethical decision at a time. And if someone asked her whether she should have been grateful to still have that seat at Richard's table 10 years after he'd tried to destroy her, Elena would smile and say, "I was never grateful for that seat, but I am grateful that he tried to take it from me, because it forced me to take the whole company instead." Sometimes the best thing a powerful man can do for a powerful woman is get in her way. It gives her the opportunity to show him exactly how strong she really is. 1 year later, on the 11th anniversary of Richard's removal from Thornton Industries, Elena received one final surprise. A letter arrived at her office, but this time it wasn't from Richard. It was from the White House. Elena had been selected to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her contributions to corporate ethics and her work supporting whistleblowers through the Morrison Foundation. The ceremony would take place in 3 months. When the day arrived, Elena stood in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by other recipients, dignitaries, and her closest friends and family. Uncle James had flown in from Toronto. Patricia was there, now Executive Vice President of Morrison Thornton Financial. Margaret Chin sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Jessica Chin, who'd started as a nervous junior analyst and was now a rising star at the company, sat beside her grandmother. As the president placed the medal around Elena's neck, she thought about that conference room 11 years ago. She thought about Richard's laughter, Marcus's contempt, the crushing weight of injustice. She thought about the choice she'd made to fight back instead of walk away, to demand accountability instead of accepting defeat. Elena Morrison, the president said, represents the best of American values. When faced with corruption and discrimination, she didn't stay silent. She documented the truth, built a coalition, and held powerful people accountable. Through her leadership, she transformed a failing company into a model of ethical business practices. Through the Morrison Foundation, she's helped dozens of whistleblowers find the courage and resources to expose wrongdoing. She proves that integrity, courage, and persistence can defeat even the most entrenched corruption. The room erupted in applause. That evening, at the reception following the ceremony, Elena found herself in conversation with other medal recipients. One of them, a retired senator who'd spent her career fighting for workers' rights, pulled Elena aside. "I want you to know something," the senator said. 20 years ago, I was a young lawyer working for a corporation that was dumping toxic waste into a residential area. When I tried to report it, they threatened to destroy my career. I was terrified. I almost backed down." "What changed?" Elena asked. "I thought about what I would tell my daughter," the senator said. "I thought about whether I wanted her to grow up in a world where powerful people could poison communities without consequences. And I realized that my fear was less important than doing what was right. She smiled at Elena. Your story reminded me of that moment. It reminded me why I fought back. And it reminded me that women who refuse to be silenced change the world. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you for telling me that. No, the senator said firmly. Thank you for being another voice in the chorus. The more of us who stand up, the harder it becomes for corrupt people to operate in darkness. As the reception wound down, Elena stepped outside onto the White House grounds. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through messages of congratulation from colleagues, former employees, people she'd mentored over the years. One message stood out. It was from an anonymous sender, and it contained just 2 sentences. I work at a company where my boss is doing exactly what Richard Thornton did. After seeing your story, I'm going to document everything and fight back. Thank you for showing me it's possible. Elena stared at that message for a long time. This was why it all mattered. Not the medal, not the recognition, not even the satisfaction of watching Richard face consequences. It mattered because somewhere, right now, another woman was making the choice to fight instead of flee. Another voice was refusing to be silenced. Elena typed a response. Document everything. Build your evidence. Find your allies. And remember, you don't need anyone's permission to demand accountability. The fight will be hard, but you're stronger than you know. When you're ready, the Morrison Foundation is here to help. She sent the message and looked up at the stars, thinking about all the women who'd fought these battles before her, and all the ones who would come after. The fight for justice, for integrity, for dignity in the workplace wasn't something that could be won once and forgotten. It was ongoing, requiring constant vigilance and courage. But Elena had proven something important. The fight could be won. 3 months later, Elena received another letter. This one was from Jessica Chin, who'd been promoted to senior analyst at Morrison Thornton Financial. Dear Miss Morrison, it read, I wanted to let you know that I've been offered a position at a larger firm with a significant salary increase. 2 years ago, I would have jumped at the opportunity without hesitation. But I've been thinking about what you taught me about values and integrity. The firm that made the offer has a reputation for aggressive tactics that sometimes cross ethical lines. After researching them thoroughly, I've decided to decline. I'd rather stay at Morrison Thornton and build my career somewhere I'm proud to work. Thank you for showing me that success without integrity isn't really success at all. Elena smiled as she read the letter. This was her real legacy. Not just the company she'd saved or the foundation she'd built, but the values she'd passed on to the next generation. Jessica's decision proved that the culture Elena had worked so hard to create was sustainable, that it would continue long after Elena herself moved on. She picked up her pen and wrote a response. Dear Jessica, your decision shows wisdom beyond your years. The easy path and the right path are rarely the same. I'm proud of you for choosing integrity over opportunity. That choice will serve you well throughout your career. And please, call me Elena. You've more than earned the right. 15 years after taking over Thornton Industries, Elena Morrison stood once more in a conference room. But this time, it wasn't in New York or Sydney or London. It was at a small nonprofit in Cleveland, Ohio, where she'd been invited to speak to a group of young women entering the business world. 20 faces looked up at her, ranging in age from 22 to 28, representing every ethnicity and background imaginable. They were hungry, ambitious, and also visibly nervous about the challenges they'd face in corporate America. I want to tell you a story, Elena began. 15 years ago, I sat in a conference room while my boss told me I should be grateful to still have a seat at his table. He was trying to intimidate me into accepting discrimination and a massive pay cut. He wanted me to know my place. She paused, watching their faces. What he didn't know was that I owned 95% of his company. He didn't know because I'd spent months quietly documenting his fraud, building a coalition of investors, and preparing to take everything he'd stolen. He laughed at me that day. By the end of the month, he was unemployed. A year later, he was in federal prison. The women leaned forward, completely engaged. I'm not telling you this story to brag, Elena continued. I'm telling you this because you need to understand something fundamental. When someone tries to make you feel grateful for scraps, they're betting that you'll accept less than you deserve. They're counting on your fear, your self-doubt, your desire to avoid conflict. And sometimes, the right response isn't gratitude, it's strategy. She spent the next hour sharing lessons from her experience. Document everything. Build relationships with people who share your values. Understand the power structures in your organization. Know when to speak up and when to gather more evidence. Recognize that sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to take it over entirely. When she finished, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Miss Morrison, what if we're not brave enough? What if we're too scared to fight back?" Elena smiled gently. "I was terrified," she admitted. "The day I decided to fight Richard Thornton, I was shaking so hard I could barely type. Fear doesn't mean you're weak. It means you understand the stakes. The question isn't whether you're afraid. The question is whether you'll let fear make your decisions for you." Another hand went up. "Did you ever regret it? The fight, I mean. Was it worth what it cost you?" Elena thought about the sleepless nights, the stress, the uncertainty. She thought about the months of gathering evidence while pretending everything was fine. She thought about the risk of losing everything if the plan had failed. "Not once," she said firmly, because the alternative was living with the knowledge that I'd let corruption win, that I'd stayed silent when I could have spoken up, that I'd accepted injustice because fighting it was hard. I couldn't live with that. So yes, it was worth it. Every difficult moment, every sacrifice, every risk, it was worth it. As the session ended and the young woman filed out, several approached Elena with their own stories. One worked at a company where women were systematically passed over for promotions. Another had witnessed financial irregularities but didn't know how to report them safely. A third had been harassed by a supervisor and was trying to decide whether to file a complaint. Elena listened to each story, offered specific advice, and made sure each woman had the Morrison Foundation's contact information. These weren't just hypothetical future problems. This was happening right now, to real people, in companies across the country. The fight was far from over. That night, in her hotel room, Elena reflected on how far she'd come. From a 32-year-old analyst being told to be grateful for a seat at the table, to a 49-year-old CEO and Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient who'd built an empire on integrity. But more importantly, she'd built a movement. The Morrison Foundation was supporting whistleblowers nationwide. Morrison Thornton Financial was proof that ethical companies could thrive. And every speech she gave, every story she shared, every woman she mentored added another voice to the chorus demanding accountability. Richard Thornton had tried to silence one woman because she threatened his corruption. Instead, he created a leader who would spend the rest of her life amplifying the voices of everyone who'd been told to stay quiet. Perfect justice didn't exist, but this was pretty damn close. This is Excellent Stories, where powerful women don't just survive, they document, they plan, they fight back, and they win. If Elena's story inspired you, if you believe that integrity beats corruption and truth outlasts lies, then you need to show it right now. Like this video? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on women who refuse to be broken. Subscribe to Excellent Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's facing their own Richard Thornton and wondering if fighting back is worth it. Because here's the thing, if you don't engage with this content, if you watch Elena's victory and then scroll past without supporting it, you're saying that stories like hers don't matter. You're saying that Richard Thornton's attempt to silence and destroy a talented woman is acceptable. You're saying that corruption and fraud and discrimination are just business as usual. Don't be that person. Hit that like button, drop a comment, subscribe and share. Stand with women like Elena Morrison who prove that powerful women win. 20 years after that fateful conference room meeting, Elena Morrison sat in her corner office at Morrison Thornton Financial's headquarters in Manhattan. At 54, she was preparing to announce her successor, a brilliant woman named Sarah Okonkwo, who embodied everything Elena had worked to build: integrity, innovation, and an unwavering commitment to ethical leadership. The announcement would come next month at the company's annual meeting. Elena would transition to chairman of the board, focusing more on the Morrison Foundation and mentoring the next generation of leaders. She'd built something that would outlast her. A company culture where merit mattered more than connections, where speaking truth to power was rewarded rather than punished, where no one had to choose between their principles and their paycheck. That was the legacy that mattered. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Richard Thornton had died quietly in a small apartment in New Jersey where he'd lived since his release from prison. Heart attack, age 73. His obituary mentioned his father's legacy, his fraud conviction, and the transformation of the company under Elena's leadership. Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions, not satisfaction at his death, but a kind of closure. Richard had spent the last decade of his life trying to atone for his crimes, donating his time to ethics education programs and speaking at business schools about the consequences of corruption. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it showed that even people who'd lost everything could still choose to do some good. She drafted a brief statement for the press. Richard Thornton's story is a reminder that no one is above accountability, but also that people can change. My focus has always been on building systems that prevent corruption, rather than celebrating its punishment. My thoughts are with his family during this difficult time. Professional, compassionate, and completely honest. That evening, Elena returned to the same conference room where it had all begun 2 decades earlier. She sat in the chair at the head of the table, the chair where Richard had once sat when he'd told her to be grateful. She thought about the journey from that moment to this one. The fear, the courage, the careful planning, the risk, the victory. She thought about all the lives that had changed because she'd refused to accept injustice. The employees who now worked in a healthy culture. The whistleblowers the foundation had supported. The young women who'd found the courage to fight their own battles after hearing her story. And she thought about the message it sent, that powerful women don't need permission to demand what they've earned, that documentation and strategy can defeat even entrenched corruption, that sometimes taking over entirely is the only way to fix a broken system. Elena Morrison had been told she should be grateful for a seat at the table. Instead, she took the whole company, built it into something better than it had ever been, created a foundation that would support justice for generations, and proved that women who refuse to be silenced don't just survive. They win. Thank you for watching this story from Excellent Stories. If Elena's journey resonated with you, if you believe in women who fight back and win, then don't just sit there. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling us what you think. Subscribe to Excellent Stories and turn on those notifications so you never miss another story of powerful women defeating corruption and building something better. And here's the truth, besties. If you don't like, comment, share, and subscribe, it's like saying you're okay with what Richard Thornton did. It's like saying you support people like Marcus Webb who help corrupt leaders destroy talented women. It's like saying that women should just accept discrimination and be grateful for whatever scraps powerful men throw their way. That's not who you are. So show us. Show us you stand with Elena. Show us you believe that integrity beats corruption, that truth outlasts lies, and that a woman's voice matters. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Be part of this community that celebrates powerful women who win. This is Excellent Stories, where the underestimated become unstoppable, where the stolen become the builders, where dignity defeats arrogance, where powerful women don't just survive, they win. Thank you for being here, besties. We'll see you in the next story.